All right, are we ready? Ready to launch? All right, we'll begin the meeting of RPIC today. Sorry for being a little late. We had some technical difficulties in our temporary home here on the North Shore. So we're going to call this meeting of the TRPA Regional Plan Implementation Committee to order. The date is Wednesday, August 3rd, 2023, and it is, what time is it? 8:45 about. First item on the agenda is a roll call to determine quorum. So let's see. Where did you say that list was?
John's on it. I think John.
John, you're going to do it? No?
No.
You'll do it? Okay, Maria.
Here. Here. Here.
Here. Here.
Maria is not on mic for me, just heads up.
Yeah, so we're
Yeah. We don't, the staff mics are not working right now, so I guess for remote members, we'll have to call you, someone up here. Will have
John,
to,
do you want us to identify ourselves when we say here?
I think we have that on. Can I just solve one problem at a time? Sorry. Yeah, I know.
we don't.
So why don't, since those online can't hear you, Maria, we need, can you come up to a mic just for that?
Take two.
Ms. Alding.
Oh.
Here. Ms. Dis. Here. Ms. Gustafson. Here. Ms. Hill.
Here.
Mr. Honigman.
Here.
Mr. Settlemeyer.
Here.
Mr. Chair, we have a quorum.
Great, thank you, Maria. All right, now I will go over the remote and in-person meeting rules for the day. For the members of the public who are joining us remotely, to observe the meeting, go to trpa.gov. Under the calendar header, click on Governing Board Hybrid Meeting for August 23rd, 2023. There you'll find a link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. To address committee members directly with your comments, raise your hand in Zoom by clicking Raise Hand at the bottom of your screen at the appropriate agenda item. With your hand raised, you'll be unmuted by TRPA staff and have 3 minutes to address the committee. If you've used the dial-in numbers to join us by telephone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and be unmuted. To remote committee members, if you wish to speak, please also raise your hand in Zoom. You'll find the hand icon on the bottom of your screen. Remote committee members may not use the chat box to make any comments or have any sidebar conversations. Please, everyone, remember to mute your mic unless speaking to cut down on background noise. Finally, I'd like to ask that all remote members turn on their cameras if they're able. Members of the public who have joined us in person, please raise your hand at the appropriate time for public comment, and you'll be called to the front to speak. Committee members who are in person, please raise your hand if you wish to comment and speak. Speak clearly into the microphone in front of you. If you're viewing the webinar on a personal computer, please ensure that your microphone and speakers are turned off to prevent audio feedback into the room. All right, so the next item is approval of the agenda. John, remote Hester, are there any changes?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a change to the item from Washoe County. It will be postponed. We will allow for public comment, and I'll give a few short context statements, but other than that, there won't be discussion on that. Other than that, the agenda is the same.
Great, thank you. So we'll deem the agenda approved as posted with the change to item 4 on the agenda, that will be discussion only. All right, so approval of minutes, agenda item 3. We have a set of minutes for May 24th, 2023 on page 7. Do any members of the committee wish to make a change?
Everyone looks at me. Boy, this is really incriminating.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a few clerical corrections that I have given to Maria. Thank you. And with that, I move to approve the minutes from the RPIC meeting of May 24th, 2023 as amended.
Great. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone object? All right, the motion passes. All right, on to item number 3. Agenda item number 3, discussion and possible recommendation for approval of the proposed amendments to the Code of Ordinances, chapters 230, 37, 50, 60, 65, 66, 67, 82, 84, 90, rules of procedures, articles 5, 10, 12, 16, and fee schedule introduction, multipliers, schedules A through J, mitigation fees, and shore zone mitigation fees in support of permitting process improvements. Information on this agenda item can be found on page 301 of your packet. As a reminder to the public, after committee discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person to be called on, or in Zoom to be unmuted by TRPA staff to share your comments. We did receive one comment from Doug Flaherty on this item that everyone should have, and it is posted to the website as well. So remote Hester, do you want to introduce?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce this. For years, we've tried to do process improvements in-house at TRPA, but our caseloads continue to increase at the same time. So we were never able to give the process improvements all the attention that we thought needed. So in 2022, we put out a request for proposals, and Stockham Consulting was a successful proposer. For those of you who don't know Arlo Stockham, he's extremely well qualified for this project. He was the TRPA planning manager in 2012 when the regional plan update was done. He's worked in the private sector representing development applicants. He's been a community development director. And right now he's processing TRPA applications as an outsourcing consultant. He brought to you about a year ago an action plan, which the board approved. And then about 6 months ago, brought specific recommendations on amending the code, the rules of procedures and fees, which you just introduced, and you all endorsed that. So this is the result of his work to implement that direction. And so now I'll turn it over to Arlo and the staff team to take away this item.
Thank you, John. Thank you, committee members. I'm very happy to be here. This is an exciting project to be working on, and I hope you'll agree that we have a lot of good improvements here. I have a fairly technical slideshow to go through. Might take about 20 minutes. You know, this is a committee meeting, so that's what we do. Wanted to at least touch on quite a few different details that we're working on, all part of a process to improve the permitting system. It's exciting to do this kind of work. Oftentimes agencies don't get to really focus on stepping back, looking at their procedures, and seeing where there are areas for improvement. And that's what we've been doing over the last 18 months, trying to improve the permitting system, make it easier for people to process environmentally beneficial development that meets all the rules, making it a little harder to sneak through things that shouldn't get through, really just creating an improved permitting process. TRPA is incredibly complex in terms of the regulations they administer and the procedures. So it's never going to be a super easy process to get through TRPA. It's not one factor that's causing those things. It's 50 little things that each take a little time or add a little confusion. And we're trying to kind of check off the major ones and make it somewhat cleaner, somewhat easier to get good things through the process. The project approach has been unique and very helpful. Essentially, I'm integrated and embedded with the staff team, getting a perspective through reviewing permits, seeing the nitty-gritty details of how procedures work. That's been very helpful. Want to just take a minute, a shout out for all the people, the staff members and the stakeholders who've contributed here. A lot of work, both in front of the cameras and behind the scenes has been going on. Project management, Jen Self here and Allie, who's hiding in the background. have been working with me very closely throughout the process to get all the necessary details, to vet the ideas, and really to come up with what we're here proposing to you. All of these ideas have been vetted multiple times through what we're calling the permitting improvement team. John Marshall, John Hester, most of the senior staff members in the permitting department, they've read this, they've suggested changes, we've incorporated those changes. So we feel confident that we have a good refined package with all the nitty-gritty code level details that are necessary. And then a lot of support staff, the finance team, the implementation team, updating Acela to address these new provisions. There's just a lot of behind the scenes work, the local government coordination. And it slid off our slide here at the bottom on the big screen. But we've been very conscious of stakeholder participation through each step of the process, and not just delivering, fully refined ideas saying, here we are, this is great. With each step where we get more detailed with these ideas, we've taken those out to stakeholders, reviewed drafts, made refinements, whether it be the planning consultants and the engineers, the local agency staff, and the League to Save Lake Tahoe. I see Gavin made it up here. We've been vetting these ideas through the league as well to make sure we're not bumping into, inadvertent environmental impacts. All of those people have been really steering this process and getting us to where we are now. Next slide, please. I mentioned kind of incrementally developing ideas. This is a kind of lame slide that shows that. We basically started with an idea generation process. What are the challenges from a staff perspective? What are ideas for improvements? Then we went out on a listening tour with stakeholders, various people involved in the process. Where do you think we have areas for improvement? Out of that, we had an issue assessment we wrote up, and that evolved into the action plan that was in front of the board and endorsed 12 months ago. That laid out the high-level priorities and started introducing ideas for improvement. We took that, did a whole nother round of outreach, and came back to this board 6 months ago with a very detailed implementation report, which was basically the work program and more specific detailed proposals for how to make these improvements. The board provided some comments and endorsed that document. And here we are implementing it with the great detail that is necessary to go into the TRPA code. So we're excited to be at this last step. We do have some additional work over the next 6 months, primarily focusing on additional administrative improvements to build upon the material that we have developed. Next slide. So our 6 top priorities, you've heard these at my prior 2 presentations, and they haven't changed. Priority 1 is really quality processes, efficiencies, consistency, predictability. People know what's going to be expected, know what's likely to be required. Second priority is making easy things easier. We got a lot of stakeholder feedback that, yeah, complex projects are always going to be hard, but easy actions don't need to take so long, shouldn't be so difficult. So we really focused on minor applications and really not insignificant improvements that aren't going to impact the lake, making those not as challenging. We have a whole suite of clarifications to the code of ordinances. One of the bigger challenges is that there are a whole suite of kind of unwritten interpretations and guidelines and rules of thumb that have been developed over the last 30 years. People don't just know those unless they work within the system quite a bit. So we're trying to get all those guidance memos and interpretations written into the language of code. We have priorities, public communication and customer service improvements, expanded staff development and training and delegating some of the easier work to lower level staff members. And then very important, maintaining adequate and dependable funding and staffing to do the permit reviews. Caseload has really increased and staff has been struggling to keep up with that caseload. So I'll be talking about these in quite a bit of detail. Next slide, please. The implementation report really got more refined and identified specific changes, and I'll speak to each of these on the slides. Next up. So what are we doing? There's really three of these priorities that are administrative action. It's not stuff that comes to the board. It doesn't involve what the code says. It's the internal procedures. So these three priorities: efficiency, consistency, customer services, staff development. We're doing a lot of internal work to enhance that, and I'll touch on those later in the presentation. But those aren't in front of you for action. Those are just everyday administrative documents. Next slide, please, which I think I explain. Really the keystone piece of that administrative work is a comprehensive administrative procedure manual. This is where we're putting in writing kind of what are the proper procedures, what are the steps, what are the items that are reviewed. So we're trying to use that as a staff training guide, a tool to ensure consistency and implementation and interpretations are the same, and also as a public resource. So applicants who really want to know what to expect through the process can read this document as well and understand what their permitting process is going to look like. A bunch of related actions. We're moving to all the staff members using shared templates and shared forms for all the permit documents and official, condition of approval language, all that type of stuff. The organization of the permitting department has been expanded. It's over 20 staff members now dealing with permitting. So we need essentially a level of mid-management to provide proper, supervision, guidance, mentoring. Every question can't end up on Wendy's desk, or she's going to just go crazy with the volume. So we've kind of built up staff teams and principal planners being in supervisory roles, so we can be more efficient and more effective in implementing the ordinances. We have a dedicated customer service staff now, so that'll be more consistent for people inquiring about TRPA, and a suite of improvements on the webpage geared towards customer service. And then I mentioned before, our next 6 months, we're really going to be focusing on building upon these initial documents, improving the application, the whole application process, the forms, the requirements, the steps, trying to make it so we get better applications coming in the door and they can be reviewed in a more effective manner. Next slide, please. So that's kind of all the back of house stuff that's going on. In terms of the items in front of the committee today and to be going to the board next month, the minor applications, the easy applications, we really have 5 significant changes to improve procedures for little things, things that most people never even notice. And I'll speak to each of these. I think I have 1 slide each. Next slide. Minor applications are one of the bigger things coming out of this process, and it's really going to change how permits are processed from the minute they're, well, really from the application form, submittal, all the way through. These will be qualifying applications, will move through the process significantly expedited, the total time going from 150 days down to 55. Upon submittal, they'll be marked, this is a minor application, and they'll be routed to a dedicated team dealing with minor applications, so they don't get hung up if there's a complex project or if a staff member gets busy with the public controversy. They should move through quite smoothly. There'll be simplified applications and simplified reviews. But these are for really the easy things. Most of the applications are what we call site and building improvements, maybe a house addition or a new deck or a walkway or things like that, a driveway expansion. The criteria are listed here. It weeds out the more complex projects that do warrant additional time. So we're looking at single parcel applications. We're looking at properties that have their BMP certs. So this likely wouldn't be development on undeveloped land, staying out of the conservation land use districts, and staying out of some of the sensitive topics that require special findings and more complex analyses, the shore zone requirements, sensitive land coverage issues, taller height. non-conforming structures, those would still have to go through the standard process. But if you meet these check marks, you can be in and out with your TRPA permit in less than 2 months. So that's a significant change procedurally for people. Some of the additional applications that can be minor, you know, the development right, banking and transferring, some of the easier coverage, lot line adjustments, some smaller grading projects could go through as minor, and a few other targeted improvements that the team didn't really feel warranted the longer review process. Next up, bundling. TRPA has requirements to sequentially get approvals. That will still be required. You'll need to do your site assessment and or land capability verification, as the case may be, before submitting for a project. But these changes will allow some additional applications to be processed concurrently. Most of these right now need to be done sequentially, not all of them. But if you have a development right transfer that supports a project, there'll be a checkbox in the application. The applicants can select a request for those to be processed concurrently and in a coordinated manner. Similarly, if you're doing a minor lot line adjustment to accommodate a project design, those can be processed coordinated. Historic resource determinations kind of already work that way. Next slide, please. So that'll help reduce the timeline for applications. Oftentimes they're infill projects that may need some development rights transfers, projects, you know, maybe some of these accessory applications. Next suite of improvements deals with this kind of strange category of activities called qualified exempt. These are things that are pretty minor, structural repair of a home, for example. It's exempt from TRPA review, but the code requires property owners to file a declaration saying, I promise it meets within these categories. That kind of morphed over the decades to become a very time-intensive process for staff that almost served as a de facto project review, except there were no fees associated with these. It created a lot of confusion. So essentially, we are moving back to what the code calls for, which is these are property owner promises, and staff will not be reviewing them and verifying and saying, hey, we caught your promise isn't accurate, or we verify your promise is correct. These will really be treated as the exempt minor things that they are. We kept them really because some of these declarations require BMPs to be installed or require various forms of mitigation. So if you move those to fully exempt, you wouldn't get excess mitigation fees or excess coverage mitigation fees, for example. So it's still a category, but it's going to be a much less intensive process. Shifted some of those down to be fully exempt. Again, so we're not spending a lot of time reviewing very, very minor things that have no impact on the lake. Next slide. Historic resources is another topic where overwhelmingly stakeholders said there is just a ton of time going into this for no added value, or very little added value. Essentially, there are significant review requirements for historic resources that are not designated, are not listed. Basically, a 50-year-old house, if you want to do an improvement to that, it requires, you know, significant process, historic resource determinations. If it was found that there was some historical event that happened back in the 1960s, you have to go to the hearings officer. It's really an unusual thing to have such an intensive process for things that aren't designated resources. So trying to simplify the process a little bit, again, not for the designated resources, just for potentially eligible resources. And then in addition, the state historic preservation offices really raised a flag and said that your code requires us to do a bunch of things too that aren't a good use of our time. You know, we have a lot of real historic resources that warrants our attention. Right now, our code says they have to help us with eligibility determinations, and that's just not a good use of their time. So the California office requested some specific changes, which we support and the Nevada office supports. Essentially, we'll refocus the state historic preservation offices on historically significant things not on routine day-to-day, hey, is this 60-year-old bungalow historically significant? Next slide. There are a list of additional decisions that are proposed to be delegated to staff as opposed to governing board or hearings officer reviews. It's pretty targeted. I mentioned the eligible historic resources. There are also some changes where underground utility replacements could be done at the staff level. Right now, any sensitive land kicks it up to the governing board. Some additional coverage could be added with EIP projects at the staff level. And probably one of the more significant ones and kind of late input we got from the locals. Right now, code has a separate process requirement for awarding bonus units compared to the projects that the bonus units support. And this is a kind of a procedural hurdle that hits affordable housing projects or attainable housing projects the hardest. We're recommending doing away with that, and essentially awarding bonus units would be an administrative action taken with approval of applicable projects by the decision-making bodies. There's really no, subjective criteria where, you should get a bonus unit, you shouldn't. It's really projects qualified for them or they don't. So that is included here. I added a couple asterisks because that was not highlighted in my last packet before the board. Everything else we've been talking about here was in front of the board previously. Shore zone applications. The main change here for a whole suite of fairly routine shore zone applications is to move those to a staff approval, but retain noticing. So this would still provide an opportunity for contested issues to rise up to the board under appeals. But it would really be a huge time saver where, everyday peers all get elevated up. The new shore zone ordinances are good. They're objective standards. I know there was some discussion of process when those came through and everyone wanted to just be sure that it's working as intended, and staff feels it has been working as intended. I know Tiffany Good is remotely somewhere with us and can get into more details on shore zone issues if you'd like during the Q&A. But again, noticing is retained for all shore zone applications that would no longer require public hearings. Next slide. Code standards. Land coverage is the classic example here. Everything at Tahoe is governed by land coverage and square feet allowed. But when you chase down what is land coverage, the definition is fundamentally unmeasurable. So it creates a lot of challenges, and it's been that way for a generation. As a result of that, staff has had to make a whole series of interpretations, what qualifies as coverage, what doesn't, various nuance aspects of the coverage ordinances. So we're trying to get as much of that clarified as we can in code. There are also clarifications on building height, a little bit in scenic quality, a couple shore zone items, a whole section on rounding. The code is silent on when you round this way or that way, and it makes a significant difference for some projects. So we have a rounding section and clarified definitions. Most notably, we're trying to make the definition of coverage measurable. So little things that may or may not be coverage are treated the same way with every application. We have a couple changes to simply eliminate procedures that are perceived as a waste of time or low value time. And we also have a comprehensive list of all the code reference documents with convenient links. So here's a whole list of coverage clarifications. You notice that so many of these are in section 30.4, which are the limits for coverage, probably one of the most important sections of the code. There are interpretations dating back over 30 years that we are writing into the code here, how the first one there is kind of a safety valve if someone's maxed out on coverage and there's something needed for public safety, how that's been administered, how coverage transfers work. There are a suite of changes in the coverage exemption section. This one was interesting for me because we spent so much time for the 2012 update creating these coverage exemptions or expanding them. And in my view, they've been wildly successful. I mean, projects are just flooding in where people are doing minor improvements to their house, maybe adding a family room or expanding a deck. And they're installing BMPs, they're getting up to date on excess coverage mitigation. I mean, it's really been more successful than I expected a decade ago. But with that success, everyone's trying to, work around the edges. Can this qualify? Can that qualify? It raised a couple areas where, hey, it doesn't make sense that this isn't eligible, but that is. So we really, quite a bit of our language is in that exemption section, clarifying what qualifies and what doesn't. I have a couple asterisks on that fourth one down there. We also did, this is kind of leaning towards more than an interpretation. There are some various improvements. Take an electric vehicle charger, which wasn't that common in 2012. That doesn't qualify for any of the coverage exemptions, but a shed does. So, or people trying to say underground their electricity, they have utility lids, they count as coverage. It just didn't make sense. So we worked in, and we're comfortable that we can do this without environmental impacts, that up to 30 square feet of exempted coverage for a shed or non-permanent structure could instead be utilized for things like HVAC units, EV chargers, small solar facilities. This still is subject to the aggregate cap on exemptions. It still is going to be limited to high capability land. So it doesn't address every situation, but we think probably 90% of these folks who are stuck with, hey, I can't underground my power because it's going to add coverage, will be able to get through and do good things with this provision. Next slide, please. More coverage clarifications. All of this stuff is offsite land coverage. There's a whole mitigation program that was kind of written up in an interpretation document that's in code. A couple clarifications on how height is measured. The reflectivity and glare standards, there's been a kind of wide variety on how staff administers some of the scenic quality standards that say you can't have a negative impact in effect. So this is more of an objective standard for when limited reflectivity windows and reflectivity limits would apply. Essentially, if a home is going to directly reflect sunlight to a lake or a designated recreation area, they will need to do upgraded low reflectivity windows. But if they're in a forest and there's no direct reflectivity onto any designated area, that's a significant cost. Those properties would not have to do low reflectivity windows. They just have to do the standard design review guidelines. Couple clarifications on shore zone. What is a boulder relocation versus dredging? Cleaned up a little inconsistency in one of the graphics. Nothing too noteworthy. Next slide, please. Definitions, I mentioned rounding. We also included rounding in the design review guideline Exhibit H, which is the document used for shoreline scenic reviews. So that's one of those areas that was less than clear how numbers were rounded. Land coverage definition, again, trying to make it measurable. Is a fence post land coverage? Is a post foundation land coverage? What size does it become land coverage? Walls, boulders, little utility lids, all that type of stuff. It's a gray area. And looking back over the years, the decisions haven't been 100% consistent because it isn't written down. And then a series of other definitions. Maybe expansion would be the noteworthy one. That clarifies the distinction between a pier modification versus an expansion, which is a much bigger process. Next slide. So those are all the clarifications, a whole bunch of them. Hopefully that's helpful for everyone. These two changes are time savers. Code requires this below the IPS line drawing, which is redundant with the incentive allocation pool. So the language would only require that drawing if there's no supply in the allocation pool. And also reducing single-family audit requirements from 10% to 5%. That probably is going to save about a quarter of an FTE just by itself. This audit process is hugely time-consuming for TRPA staff and for the local agencies. And 5% is still a pretty high audit rate. And then the code reference documents. Next up, I'm almost through. I know this is boring and technical. Everyone loves procedures and ordinances. But last but not least are fees. When we came into this process, it became pretty clear that there's a fundamental mismatch, and the permitting program was not generating enough funding through application fees to cover operations. It still isn't. It hasn't for some time. That's just a fundamental issue, because either you need to subsidize permit reviews with the general fund, raise fees, reduce process. It needed to be addressed. The direction I've gotten and the direction we've pursued is to focus principally on process improvements. There are many areas where the team can operate more efficiently, and we think this package, I've just rattled off 20 of them, should help us get there. So I'd say 90% of the changes are to improve the process rather than raise fees. However, we do have some targeted fee increases and some decreases, really to try to address those fees that just seem out of whack with the work required, the obvious mismatches. And we're developing or have developed a revenue and expense reporting system where we can track in greater detail what revenues are coming in for different categories of applications, what the review costs are, and that data can be used to inform future fee changes if needed. I like to think that maybe fees could go down with all these improvements, but we really don't know. Next slide. So generally region-wide, just a few targeted fee changes. Probably one of the bigger ones is a new multiplier. You guys have fee multipliers for certain procedures. You have multipliers for hearing officer and governing board review. This would add a smaller multiplier for that staff decisions, but with noticing to reflect the additional review time that noticing creates. The second one, there's a relic from a bygone era that charged a fee multiplier in special planning areas, which also happen to be all your infill incentive areas. So you're charging infill areas more than other areas, which seems to reverse incentives. So we're getting rid of that. Similarly, tourist accommodation fees are lower than multifamily. So someone can apply for a timeshare with lower fees than the exact same building used for multifamily housing units. The review is somewhat more complex for tourists or similar. So we're equalizing those fees. Daycare is a fee subsidy here to reduce that as an important community need, not unlike affordable housing. Qualified exempt, apply that fairly nominal fee to all of them. And a couple fees for things that staff is essentially doing for applicants without fee now. So that's region-wide, pretty targeted. Most of the projects, I don't think there's going to be an increase or decrease generated by these changes. It's just refinements. In the shore zone is where, next slide, please. Shore zone is where we found that a lot of the funding mismatch occurred. New shore zone ordinances were adopted about 5 years ago. The fees were not adjusted at that time. I don't know where these original fees started, but they've been there for a long time. And some of them just don't come close to covering the cost of reviews. The first one, and is probably more significant one, is shoreland scenic reviews. These are the lakefront homes doing an addition or whatever that's visible from the lake. There's a very complex review process. So we're recommending 2 levels of fees. The easy one's 1,000, the harder one's 2,000 to minimize impacts for the small projects. But these, $30 million lakefront homes, their scenic analyses are very complex. It takes quite a bit of time, and it's just not covering those staff costs with our current fees. The shore zone applications, we have a mooring lottery eligibility review under $100, doesn't approach the staff time needed to review those. Buoys have some increases, and pier expansions. Those were the applications that we saw that were just clearly not funding the cost of review. And that's the limit of what we're changing now. That table at the bottom shows the aggregate impact because the process, the staff approvals result in a fee decrease compared to governing board approvals. So that kind of offsets some of the increased fees for shore zone projects. So overall, relatively modest changes. You'll notice the proposed fees for all piers are the same in all their flavors. That's because they all require about the same review. Right now, probably the pier expansions were the one application that was, most problematic from a funding perspective. I think that's everything. All right. So we're here to get your feedback, questions, suggestions for adjustments, whatever it may be. We're planning to be at the APC and at the governing board next month. There'll be a 60-day effective period. So these changes to fees and ordinances would go into effect near the end of November. And again, we have some additional, mostly internal administrative improvements planned. And I think we just have your standard slide to open it up for the meeting process. Thank you for your time and bearing with me for the long presentation.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could make one comment before we go to public comment, because I missed this in the introduction, and I know it's important to Julie and the rest of us, is that Arlo said this, but I want to emphasize that we specifically asked them to look at where we could be more efficient before we raise fees. So we're going to, as Arlo said, we're going to try to get as much efficiency as we can before we ask applicants to pay more. So I just wanted to emphasize that because that's very important. And I know it's important to the board. So thank you.
Great, thank you, John. I wanted to commend Arlo and the staff for all the incredible work. I mean, that's a lot, the result of a lot of work. I mean, we just saw the the brief version. I think, we got the detailed version in our packet, and the amount of work that you guys did is incredible. And I think it's really important that we're always looking to improve how we do what we do, to make it faster and more reliable for the public and more affordable for us, so we can focus our resources on other things. So great project. Thank you, all the staff who was involved, and to you, Arlo. So now we'll open it up for committee questions. Anyone? Shelley?
I want to support Vince's comments. Thank you, Arlo. And I remember working with you on the regional plan update, so I know how detailed focused you are, and I commend you and staff for doing a great job of cleaning up our code. I just had a couple of questions concerning historic structures. Does staff have access to the resources they need to evaluate the historic significance of structures? I mean, I understand that maybe the state departments are overburdened with their own concerns elsewhere, but does staff confer routinely with local historical societies? Do they ever use outside consultants who have knowledge of potentially historically significant structures to determine their eligibility? I mean, we've lost a lot of important historic resources in this basin, and I would just hate to see what few that remain. I'd hate to see them jeopardized. So could you clarify that for me?
I can, and Jen may want to expand on my answer. The time that's spent on these routine determinations of every old bungalow is really not adding, it's not doing what you're looking for it to do for historic preservation and historic resource protection. It's taking a whole bunch of time and diverting it to very insignificant issues and resources. The compact and then the regional plan, it really sets up a structure focused on identifying significant historic resources and implementing protection measures for those. Kind of this side program for the unidentified possible resources has taken on a life of its own. So I think the whole idea here is free up a little time to not spend. It's still going to be a check, but the SHPOs, they're like, what are you even doing? Why are we even talking about this? It's because code says we have to talk about it. It's going to allow staff to focus more. And we've talked about possibly a future long-range project to update those historic resource lists. That's what the regional plan really focuses on. And the historic list hasn't been updated, I don't think, in 30 years. So that's where staff would like to spend the time, not on every single application gets 4 hours of historic review, but on a focused effort to identify, we know certain historic areas that have more historical significance. There are processes where we could go through and maybe integrate it into the area plan process as well to identify those additional resources. But this is kind of all it's like the side, it's like the tail wagging the dog a little bit, all this time being spent on the not significant things. So I don't know if that's a good answer. Jen, would you like to expand on that? A lot of staff time on what do we do with this historic topic?
I would. Jen Sell, for the record, principal planner. I'm under Wendy Jepson's department in permitting now. So Shelley, to answer your question, does staff have the tools to really evaluate and, propose, proper mitigation for projects that impact these structures? And the answer is yes. The code today does outline, okay, what criteria would a property qualify to be considered historic? We also have a qualified architectural historian on board. That is myself. So I have degrees in historic preservation. I've worked for the National Park Service with preservation, architectural historian. And then Bruce Barr is also a qualified archaeologist. And so we do have staff on board that, we can consult and talk to and look at these projects. And then there's also, if we deem a project to does have a higher level of historic integrity or significance, then there are qualified architectural historians that the applicants can consult with as well in the basin. And there's a number of these that we have a list and we can provide those to folks. Similar, if you want to, consult a qualified engineer for, a deck remodeler, structure, things like that, other specialists. There are professionals in the community that can help applicants as well.
So basically, I'm sensitive to this because, being over the age of 50, I could be designated as historically significant. So it resonates with me. But so that is not going to be used as a criteria anymore, simply the age of the structure.
It still will. There still will need to be a review, a historic resource determination for every structure over 50 years.
Okay.
We're just making that process less time intensive.
Okay.
So no one's going to slip through and
Sure.
something hugely significant doesn't get a determination.
Okay. All right.
Yes,
Fair enough.
and we, Shelley, you're obviously very important and very significant, but we like to, let people know anytime a structure is over 50 years of age, we take a pause just to do an evaluation. I like to remind applicants, just because it's old does not mean it's historic. There's a lot of structures in the Tahoe Basin that were built rather quickly and haphazardly during the 60s and 70s, and now we're at that stage. So there's a lot of projects coming in under this. We do have set criteria, so it's only a very small percentage that are truly going to have some integrity, some significance that would change the process of how projects are reviewed in the future.
I don't know, Jen, if you've ever encountered this in the basin, but in Carson City, we have some potentially historic structures that have been allowed by design to fall into disrepair so that they can be deemed a threat to public health and safety and can be removed. And I don't know if you've ever encountered that before, but I often, it amazes me that people buy historic structures or potentially historic structures with the intent of demolishing them ultimately. I mean, that's their ultimate goal as opposed to renovating them. But I don't know if that's ever been an issue for anything that's potentially historic in the Tahoe Basin. And I'm not sure what the remedy for that is, since it's privately owned, other than to provide them with incentives, and perhaps moving forward with some sort of designation that would prevent them from tearing the structure down. Is that something you've encountered?
I have not personally encountered that. TRPA does have a truly designated historic resource list This was something that was put in place in 1987 with that regional plan. That includes Thunderbird Lodge, some of the old Barton properties, Camp Richardson, things like that, that truly hold a regional significance. And so we do have that designated process, and that is not changing under these amendments today. And we have seen some success stories over the last couple of years. For example, there was a private residence, the Schilling residence on the West Shore, that the property owner actually donated that to the Tahoe Cross Country. And so that property was disassembled and it's sitting in storage down in Carson City. And so, there are some incentives in place through taxes and things like that for people to retain some of that old Tahoe history. But there hasn't been, I would say, a quote unquote threat to the designated, regionally significant historic resources in the basin.
Okay, thank you. So if I can just, I've got a lot of Post-it notes here. They're just kind of minor clarifications. So the application fee increases, is some of the more significant increases, do they relate to the frequency with which applications are submitted that are incomplete? Is that factored into the equation, or is it just basically based on processing time? And
So it's more an average time of review. What does it typically take to review a buoy? And staff was just like that. $300 fees, nowhere close to covering what it typically takes to review a buoy. We had aggregate budget information, but we don't have very fine-grained budget information to kind of verify each application category, whether it's self-sufficient. So really, this was the best judgment. And again, those fees that just seem significantly out of whack, that we don't really need more data to know that they're not aligned with the work required.
even though in some cases, if applications are continually submitted and they're incomplete, that's going to obviously increase the number of hours that staff spends verifying, the sufficiency of the application. So in some cases, it may bump up against that increase, right?
Yeah, there's some of that. That's kind of a semi-related separate issue we're dealing with in the procedure manual to kind of limit, how many times that can happen and not have, repeated, hold, resubmit under the same application.
Okay.
But you're not going to get 100% away from that.
So, and I suppose this is for some people in the basin, this is going to create some heartburn in terms of accepting from governing board review the recognition of new multiple parcel use piers and buoy field expansions. Will the outcomes be memorialized in a monthly project report of some sort?
Yes, I know staff plans to bring reports forward and
Okay.
And expand some of the reporting on these topics.
Okay. There's one little clerical change. Can we? I'm sorry. It's just compulsive with me.
You can shoot me your list if you'd like.
On page 321 of our packet, it's under seasonal outdoor retail sales use.
Oh, Jen wrote that. It was her fault. Just kidding.
So it says, provided the use and then colon, and then you have 5, instances where this comes into play. Paragraph number 3, there's a extraneous B. It should be provided the use is located in the plan area designated mixed use, commercial and public service.
We will correct that. Thank
Okay,
you.
you're welcome. And then another small clerical correction on the following page. That's page 322 under subdivision identification signs. It's a third line beginning structures shall be not over 12 inches high and shall not be. You need to insert a B between not and internally illuminated. On page 327, we're talking about transfer standards, and paragraph 5 says This provision shall not be used in conjunction with any project that adds coverage or converts existing coverage to exempted coverage exemptions. Could you explain
Other
that
typo.
in accordance with subparagraph 30.4.6?
Yeah, this is a, well, I think we have a typo there we can fix, but this is kind of this is an important section. It's a relief valve that if you have a property that's maxed out on coverage that was maybe developed 40 years ago, and there's something that needs to go in for
Mhm.
public safety reasons or for access of the disabled, you can buy coverage and transfer it from another project as kind of the final relief valve.
Okay.
This hasn't been written down, but Wendy and her team, there's a series of kind of rules of thumb to minimize and avoid, people taking advantage of this for things that shouldn't occur. So we tried to, set limits on when this can be used. People often try to use this provision to kind of de facto increase their allowable coverage. So this would say, hey, if you're doing coverage exemptions and you're making coverage available by exempting certain coverage, you have coverage available for this emergency need. You can't get additional coverage.
And that would include any coverage that's banked on the site.
Yeah, they have to use everything they have available. And then the amount transferred has to be the minimum necessary to meet that public safety need.
Okay.
Staff spends a lot of time kind of in discussions on how much, what design, and we're trying to, create some stronger guardrails for that.
Okay. Okay. And then on under paragraph 6, it says this subparagraph should not be interpreted to require the removal of existing living area, garage space, vehicle access routes, pedestrian access routes, the first 1,000 square feet of a driveway. Okay.
I know.
I mean, obviously, we encourage people to pave surfaces that are compacted, because it's kind of de facto coverage, right, already, and paving sometimes is an important water quality improvement. So could you?
So you honed in on the section that we spent a ton of time kind of discussing and trying to, how are we going to deal with this? Various interpretations. Some people could interpret the current language to say, you don't need to add coverage. You can just reduce the size of your deck, or you can remove your family room and then provide for this public safety need. So this is kind of saying, hey, we're not going to make you tear down your house. We're not going to make you tear down, your porch. But a lot of these properties will also have a massive driveway that can park 12 cars. And then they say, hey, we need a path for public disabled access. It's like, wait a second, no, you can shrink your driveway a little bit to provide that coverage. So there's nothing magic about that 1,000 square feet, but it was kind of like, this is reasonable. We shouldn't make people shrink their driveways down below a certain level. And we have to keep in mind that the environmental impact of this provision is limited because they have to buy coverage from somewhere else and transfer it in. So that again is just kind of, it's one of those guardrails on the other side saying we're not going to make you tear down your stuff in order to provide public safety.
Okay, well, I certainly agree with that. I just, as long as the, functionality obviously is important too. So that'll be taken into consideration. You're talking more about reducing parking spaces and width, not length.
And on that, we tried to keep some amount of administrative discretion because every situation's unique, but try to minimize some of the crazy requests that come in and that would just clearly not qualify.
Okay. Under screening and orientation on page 349, let's see, projects with vegetation screening and or surface plane orientations preventing sunlight glare from directly reflecting onto Lake Tahoe, scenic roadway unit, or a scenic recreation area are exempt from these reflectivity and glare standards. And I'm assuming, and maybe this is just assumed, as long as the vegetation screening is properly maintained and continues to mitigate glare, right? You don't think there's any need to, to include that as kind of a prerequisite?
I mean, we could, this can get very complex.
Yeah.
How this evolved is kind of in special situations, you'll have homes, maybe like the Upaway subdivision, homes up on ridge lines,
Right.
where in the morning or evening, you get a bunch of glare off the windows. So staff was starting to condition in those unique situations, additional requirements to limit reflectivity. And there were some differences in how that's been interpreted. Some people were requiring it everywhere. Some people were requiring it just on those very prominent properties. So we tried to kind of set a standard that said, hey, if you're really going to glare, this will be required, but every home in Homewood isn't going to need to do this. We didn't want to get into kind of like the shore zone or shoreland program where we have to collect bonds and monitor the growth of trees. It seemed a little bit excessive. So that's why we had it that way. If we said you have to maintain it, how do we enforce that? And how that kind of becomes a whole animal on its own.
Isn't there some sort of enforcement, though, protocol now for mitigations that involve the use of vegetation?
Yes, and it oftentimes involves, posting security and,
Right.
Okay. So we struggled a little bit with what should qualify or what shouldn't, but we feel pretty confident, or maybe we can massage the language a little, that, if these are homes in a forested area, yeah, there's a chance the whole forest burns down and we're going to get a little glare, but it's an unlikely circumstance.
Okay, sure, yeah.
I was just going to follow up on this section while we're on here. I recently received an email, and I know Julie did too, on solar panels.
Mhm.
A lot of people realize they're not truly economically advantageous, but they're trying to do the right thing for
Right.
the environment. Are there some solar panels that wouldn't require an outside expert to come in and do the whole reflectivity study? Are there things that we've done to work on that, or?
Yeah, I wish these answers were really simple and clear cut,
Oh,
because
that's what I
it's
thought
always
that's why we
simple.
picked you, make it all very easy.
there's levels to that. This would address, solar panels everywhere in the region except on the lakefront parcels. So, you do limited reflectivity panels and you're going to be okay. When you get into the
Without
shoreland,
additional review, but if
without
you're in the,
additional. Now you get into shoreland scenic review, and we have not kind of standardized solar panels on lakefront homes through this process. However, I understand you initiated kind of some climate amendments, and Jacob Stock. I spoke with him earlier this week. He's on paternity leave, but working his way back. And he is working on kind of addressing the more complex situations, the lakefront homes. We might go to like a super non-reflectivity standard. They have some of those near airports. And we did the same. It's kind of like EV chargers. We're trying to support those climate initiatives, but we didn't do everything. So, this isn't making it super simple for commercial scale, solar power generation, or a big EV charging field, or, new coverage on SEZs. But for most of the situations, it's addressing it, and Jacob's aware of the gaps, and he's going to try to fill those gaps with nuanced solutions.
I definitely appreciate that. I know, those are the efforts that we want to encourage, but within reason. So I appreciate that.
We talked about trying to do more with this package on the climate amendments, but we were sensitive to keep this within scope and focused on process. And also that we're not scoped out to do an EIS with this effort. So, some of these bigger changes would have triggered additional environmental review.
Thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. Under qualified exempt activities in the shore zone on page 352, I realized that the geological definition of a boulder is anything that's 10 inches or larger. But 10-inch rock is not very big.
A 50-year-old building.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, I suppose the alternative, if you want to remove larger rocks, would be to get a permit, right?
Yes.
Okay, which will be a little more expensive, but is that why you use 10 inches? Because that's how a boulder is defined from a
I think
geological
John
standpoint?
Marshall and Tiffany Good worked on an
Okay. all right.
interpretation on this topic, which we're embedding into code here. So I
As
can give you more
landscaping folks are
detail.
concerned, a 10-inch rock is not a boulder. But I understand you have to use some sort of definition.
Yeah. Hi, if I can just chime in and clarify, this is Tiffany Good, Principal Planner. For the record, yes, Shelley, you're correct. We we had to draw some lines in order to help define what is a qualified exempt activity versus what requires a permit and what is no longer falls within that qualified exempt activity. So that, that is where we landed. There are some other criteria that are included as well, including total cubic yards of material to be relocated. So there's kind of a menu from which an applicant can use to help determine if they are undergoing a boulder relocation activity that would qualify as a qualified exempt activity, and also help staff as well. So that's where that came from.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And one last comment on page 380 under shore zone fees. So paragraph 3, motorized boat rental concession fee is just a clerical thing. The mitigation fee schedule shall assess a separate fee. If you're going to use 4 before the colon, then you need to eliminate 4 in A and B. Or you can eliminate 4 in the preceding paragraph and just say a separate fee for every boat. Just again, it's just a clerical thing. And so I guess for new construction and expansion, I noticed if you increase the height of the dock, that's not considered an expansion, right? That's excluded. I think height is excluded. It's width. I thought that's what I read somewhere in the material, that height is not considered an expansion.
Tiffany, do you know this one offhand?
Yeah, that's Shelley, I believe you're correct that height, I'll have to pull it up, but I can confirm that for you and let you know, but width is considered an expansion. You are correct.
In general, we don't allow superstructure on piers.
No, but for example, John, if you were elevating the deck,
Height of the pier deck
Right.
off the water.
right, that's not.
Yeah. Why
that's
don't,
considered an
Tiffany,
expansion.
why don't we,
It's not an expansion.
That is correct, Shelley. That's not considered an expansion. Oftentimes the recommendation to TRPA to raise a pier deck has to do with where the pier is located, and if the pier is located in an area of the lake that gets a lot of wind and wave action, that additional pier deck is a safety feature in that regard. So that's why it is included in that modification, I guess, definition rather than expansion.
Okay, well, that's reasonable. All right, thank you, Tiffany. Thank you. That's it. That's all.
Any other committee member comments? Yeah, Jessica.
Thank you very much for the presentation and all the hard work. It was a lot of information, so I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. You said for the new exemption related to piers, multi-use and multifamily piers and buoy field expansions, that there would still be noticing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Is that reflected in a change in the rules of procedure?
It is.
Okay.
There's, I believe
Didn't see
it's
it.
section 12 lays out noticing requirements, and those items are added in. So none of the rules change. It's really a process change. No public hearing, but noticing required.
And then the appeals process would be the same as it
Correct.
currently is.
Correct.
Okay.
The noticing allows your neighbors to know what's going on so they can appeal if they're concerned.
So the question that I just wrote down has to do with appeals obviously have to be accompanied by a fee, right? for processing. Is there a threshold based on the number of objections received that would result in elevating the project to a hearings officer review?
No.
No, not
So
currently.
in chapter 2, the governing board basically delineates by project type,
Mhm.
not controversy as to where projects fall, whether they are reserved by the board, delegated to the hearings officer, or delegated to the executive director. Just want to clarify one thing, Jennifer, that Jessica, that it's not an exemption. It's still a permit, but it's who issues the permit, whether it's hearings officer or the executive director or the governing board.
Right, sorry, I didn't mean
I
to
just
say
wanted
that.
to
I
clarify.
understood that part. I just
Okay,
said
so
it
John,
wrong.
there has to be a formal appeal. You can have 1,000 people objecting, but somebody has to take the initiative to submit an appeal.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other committee member? Okay, James.
Thank you. In that respect, when we're discussing the changes and some of the fees and so forth, I kind of view those more as use type situations where you're just trying to cover the cost by the agency rather than having an increase go to the populace as a whole, having it more specific to that actual use. I just wanted to make sure that characterization was correct. And that these are only for nothing that's already existing. It's for if someone chooses to change how their utilization is currently occurring. Am I correct in that characterization?
That's correct.
Thank
It's
you.
for people applying for changes to their properties so that those application fees would cover the cost of review.
Some more of a utilization increase. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I had one, as long as we have historical experts here and my age obviously exceeds your age, that 50 years is a little young. And I wonder what other jurisdictions are doing, because when you look at the mass of our development, at least on North Shore, happened around the late 50s, early 60s. And so you look at that and you go, we're long past 50 years in those structures. And so it's just a pretty wide swath of potential review of staff. Are any other jurisdictions looking at longer timelines and when designations occur?
I can certainly take that. Jen Self for the record. The 50 years mark or trigger, if you will, is more of a national standard. The Secretary of the Interior has standards for the treatment of historic properties and things like that. That really sets the standard for local jurisdictions, for state parks, for national parks, things like that. So most jurisdictions will have a similar timeframe, that 50 years mark. This amendment package tackles some of the low-hanging fruit. Here's what we can do today to change this process and still be compliant with our compact and our rules of procedure and things like that. We intend in the next phase of this work to do a deeper dive into our historic resources chapter. That is chapter 67 of our code. Is actually, I think, maybe the only chapter that wasn't updated with the 2012 regional plan. And so we want to look at process improvements more widely for historic resources in the next phase, which will occur between like November and March. So you could approach that a couple of different ways. Maybe we change processes for, instead of doing parcel by parcel determinations, maybe we'll look at a neighborhood and, see what structures could be potentially eligible. We could look at that specific criteria. Do we increase that to a certain time frame? And if so, what time frame makes sense within the historic context of the basin? So there's a couple different ways that we can approach those triggers, if you will.
Yeah, I did some work when I was still in my career path and in looking at particularly the dam project and what we had to do there to put the bike trail crossing. And 50 years was the mark then, and that was over 20 years ago. So, updating those numbers are really looking at truly what is historic and meaningful is important when you look at most of our subdivisions having been built out more than 50 years ago now. So thanks.
If I could just briefly add, we discussed quite a bit, should we change the timeline and the date? And there was some concern about that, hey, there are historically significant things. I think the preference from the staff team was to have a less cumbersome process, but still kind of have that filter using that same age trigger.
There's a reference, I believe, in the code changes, Arlo, having to do with entering into an MOU with the state with the SHPOs. And does that have to do with, kind of insulating TRPA from potential liability if a historic structure is demolished, or something is eligible, is removed, or is it just more a delegation of authority?
I think there's procedural aspects to that, but it's also
James.
Sorry.
James has an answer to this.
For clarification, James Sotomayor, Director, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. One of the divisions that falls under me is SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, which operates with funds from the National Historic Preservation Act, which hereby dictate anything over 50 years that is going to be touched on federal property or have federal funds associated with it have to go through these protocols and rules and procedures. So if you don't like the age number, please contact your federal representative and have them change that. But in that respect, I think the 50 is kind of required under the National Preservation Historic Act, especially when utilizing federal funds or on federal property.
Mhm.
So it's not really anybody's, it'd be interesting to see if you could try to change that, but I think that the federal government would come back upon you and state that, well, that's nice that you have your number. But according to federal rules, you do have to use the 50 years. Just for
And that's where I think,
clarification.
again, designating certain areas and certain areas of interest is critically important. But when you look at a whole subdivision of condominiums built in 1972, it's now historic. And
This is all part of an
Yeah.
effort to kind of shift the focus to focus on the more significant areas, the more significant resources. It's all related.
And for clarification, James Sotomayor again, if it's private property, that's private property. But if they want to use any federal funds, that's what triggers it. Thank you.
So the MOU is more a delegation of authority. Is that correct, Jen?
So underneath our code today, and here is what we are amending at the request of the State Historic Preservation Offices of both California and Nevada, is that our code delegates and says that TRPA staff shall consult SHPO on potential matters, and it actually delegates some authority to what mitigation measures we will ask for if a historic resource is impacted in some way. SHPO has said, we don't have legal authority to do that. So you have delegated authority that we don't want. And this is outside of our purview, and it's outside of our legal authority to do this. And so at the request of both California, and we consulted with Nevada, and they said, yes, we absolutely agree with the advice that California gave you. We would like for you to amend our code to remove this language.
So was I incorrect? I think there's a reference to an MOU.
I-
What would the MOU be used for? What would it accomplish?
I believe that was in our prior implementation report where that
Oh.
was one of the long-term actions we were looking at moving forward with,
Okay.
but you don't have an MOU as part of this package in front of you.
And there's no language in the packet in front of us that would require the development of an MOU. as far as you know.
No, it essentially takes that authority that Jen mentioned the states didn't want and puts it back to TRPA.
That's correct. This is Jen Self. So TRPA does not have an existing MOU with the State Historic Preservation Offices, and we are not proposing an MOU. We can make these amendments as TRPA, and these changes could be effective if it's approved.
Okay, all right, thank you.
James, did you still have another comment? Any other committee member comments? All right, then we'll open it up for public comments on this matter. Any members of the public? Let's see, where are we? We'll go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the committee on this agenda item, please raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking on the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you'll be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. All right, we have a public comment in the room.
Steve Dolan, Incline Village. Please make the packet I've given you public or part of my public comment. Recently, we had a meeting at up on the mountain with a lot of Forest Service people, and thank you, Executive Director, for allowing your staff to join us. And I noticed in this presentation that you didn't mention working with the Code Compliance Enforcement Group. I hope actually that was an oversight, because there we have a problem both up at the mountain and possibly by streamlining your permitting plan. Hopefully, the streamlining will allow more compliance agents so that we don't have 4 years of violations as was established on the 4th up on the mountain. We had 3, but now it's 4. Unfortunately, TRPA's group was there to see the BMP violations, dramatic violations. And so I just hope that although this you have said is focusing on the smaller projects, I hope that the larger ones that you have interagency work with doesn't, or at least gets rid of the double standard that was explained up on the mountain the other day. This double standard I don't think is fair, both to the public, and can be used inappropriately to add fees to the public citizens' approach to getting permits. It's happened in the past. And I can talk about that later if you'd like. However, I just hope that this reduction does not affect the monitoring and enforcement of BMP laws. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in person? All right, are there any hands raised on Zoom?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll help you from here. There's one hand raised online. Toby Tyler, if you unmute, you can address the committee.
On behalf, it's Toby Tyler, on behalf of the Tahoe area group of the Sierra Club, I have the following comments regarding the proposed changes to the code. No justification or environmental analysis has been provided for the changes to Chapter 2, Section 2.2.2E, Recreation Project 1A, whereby, quote, environmental improvement projects involving no more than 3,000 square feet of floor area or 15,000 square feet of land coverage, unquote, are exempted from review and approval by the governing board. This modification of your code without more thorough analysis and justification for this change is arbitrary and capricious. In addition, Chapter 50, Section 50.5.2A, reserved allocations 2 and 3, provides additional language regarding allocations and additional complications to the trading schemes for residential allocations or shell games as the public see it. There needs to be a complete audit of the allocation system, beginning with the date of the 2012 regional plan update. These modifications in the entire allocation system are obscure, complicated, lack transparency, and require complete trust in TRPA staff. This trust among the public is at an all-time low. Please perform an audit and allow the public to see how TRPA is abiding by the RPU and the Tahoe Bi-State Compact. Under E of that section 50.5.2, a change in E3, permit monitoring and compliance, is made that reduces the representative sample audit from 10% to 5%. for single-family residential permits. Again, no justification or environmental analysis has been provided for this reduction. Therefore, this change is arbitrary and capricious. We request that these changes not be made until further analysis and justification is provided and a complete audit be performed, which details the training schemes that have been allowed to occur over the last 12 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other hands?
No, Mr. Chair, there are no other hands raised.
Okay, then we'll close public comment and go back to committee. Yeah,
So I guess where I found the reference to the MOU is on page 350. Under chapter 67, it's under the priority number 2, part of the priority number 2 list, which is pursue development of MOUs with state historic preservation offices to comply with the TRP code of ordinances and limit when consultation is warranted. So while I understand that the SHPOs are not interested in getting, too intimately involved in this review process, there still is apparently an interest by TRPA, or is it a mutual interest to establish some sort of more formalized arrangement with the state historic preservation offices?
Yes, thank you. That language you see that's the column that summarizes the implementation report recommendations. So the implementation report did suggest that as a long-term effort. I think it has some potential to focus efforts on more significant areas, but there's no work underway today or, immediate work to do those MOUs.
Okay.
But it's one of those long-term opportunities to be more effective.
Thank you, Arlo.
did anyone from staff or Arlo, did you want to address any of the public comments that you heard specifically, or? It's not. Oh,
while Arlo's thinking, Julie Reagan, TRPA Executive Director, I would like to address the comments and then also just go back to John Hester's introduction from a high level. What I really want to make sure the committee and the public and the board understand, in my time at the agency, we've been making some incremental process improvements over the years. But this is really the first time, I think, thanks to the leadership of Arlo and the incredible team that we've put together for this, to focus TRPA's energy where we have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of lake preservation and our mission. And when I interviewed every single member of our staff, I heard such frustration of being twisted up in knots to take time for things that really don't make a meaningful difference in terms of our mission and the lake. And this is moving us in the direction of streamlining those areas to free up space and capacity for truly bigger, more substantial lake preservation goals of our staff. And I think that ties to the scenic and the historic discussions that we've had here today. Freeing up more space, just in the way that when we did the total maximum daily load, the TMDL, we came to the conclusion based on science that not every single drop of runoff in the basin is created equal, and we should prioritize our infrastructure and our needs for water quality by need. And it's a very similar analogy to what I think we're doing here. But on a big picture, that is what I want to put in the record. And then I'll ask Arlo to comment on anything more specific. Thank you.
These were some new thoughts I hadn't heard from these stakeholders before. Just to give some comfort level that the code enforcement team, Steve Sweet particularly, was closely involved with all of this. And a number of these changes have been made in large part to make their job easier and more effective. So the whole team's been involved, including code enforcement. I'm not sure what issue there was up on the Hill that kind of generated these concerns, but we really vetted these closely to make sure that process improvements are not going to create any negative environmental impacts.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add one other response. One of the commenters talked about the allocation process. The allocation process was looked at after the 2012 regional plan update. The RPIC specifically delegated that request to the APC. They put together a committee that looked at it. The criteria are very straightforward in code. They are TMDL compliance. They are results of the audit, and they are results of evaluation of the short-term rental programs each local government has. That process is done every 2 years in public meeting, and the results are brought back to the governing board with the scoring and the recommendations. So I just wanted to make it clear that the allocation process is very transparent. It's very clear what it's based on, and all of the steps are made public every time it's done every 2 years. So just wanted to point that out.
Great, thank you, John. Any other committee member comments? All right, then we will entertain some motions. We have 3 motions to make on this item. In order for the motions to pass, an affirmative majority vote by RPIC members is required. So these are long motions. Should I read them and then someone can, okay. So the first motion, if someone would like to make it, is a motion to recommend approval of the required findings, attachment D, including a finding of no significant effect for the adoption of amendments to the Code of Ordinances, chapters 2, 30, 37, 50, 60, 65, 66, 67, 82, 84, and 90. Rules of Procedure Articles 5, 10, 12, and 16. Design Review Guidelines Appendix H, and fee schedule to implement recommendations of the permitting improvement project.
So moved.
Great, thank you. All right, we have a motion. Any questions on it? Seeing none, Maria, can you please call the roll?
I'll take that.
Oh, John's going to do it since he has a
responsibility.
mic. Great, thank you.
Ms. Aldine,
Yes.
Ms. Gustafson,
Yes.
Ms. Dis,
Yes.
Mr. Honigman,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Settlemeyer,
Yes.
motion passes.
Great, thank you. All right, the second motion is a motion to recommend approval and adoption of ordinance 2023 attachment E, amending ordinance 87-9 as amended for the adoption of amendments to the TRPA Code of Ordinances, chapters 2, 30, 37, 50, 60, 65, 66, 67, 82, 84, and 90. Rules of Procedure Articles 5, 10, 12, and 16, and Design Review Guidelines Appendix H to the TRPA Governing Board. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
All right.
Could I request that that motion include the clerical corrections that member Aldine raised?
Great. Yes, including the recommendations from committee member Aldine. Perfect. If you accept that.
Yes, so moved
Okay,
with the corrections.
great. John, would you please call the vote?
Mr. Settlemeyer,
Yes.
Mr. Honigman,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Ms. Gustafson,
Yes.
Ms. Dis,
Yes.
Ms. Aldine,
Yes.
motion passes.
Great, thank you. And finally, our third motion, a motion to recommend approval and adoption of resolution 2023 attachment E, amending the fee schedule to the TRPA Governing Board. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Shelley. All right, John, you want to call?
Ms. Aldine,
Yes.
Ms. Gustafson,
Yes.
Ms. Dis,
Yes.
Mr. Honigman,
Yes.
Ms. Hill,
Yes.
Mr. Settlemeyer,
Yes.
motion passes.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Arlo and the staff. A lot of work, a lot of great discussion. I always appreciate Shelley, you reading everything at the finest of level. And no, it's incredible. So thank you, everyone. All right, we will move on to agenda item 4. John is going to speak to this. Washoe County has asked to postpone this, but we are going to take comments from members of the public since a lot of people have taken the time to show up. So John, you want to take this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as I mentioned at the outset, The county has asked that the RPIC postpone its discussion of this item to next month. So I'm only going to provide some very brief context comments so that you'll understand if the public is making comments, what they're talking about. Ask you to receive comments from the public out of respect for their time and effort, and then postpone any further discussion. So just by way of context, the county is considering an amendment per the process in our area plan handbook. The first step is with us is to seek RPIC input on issues. So that's what the original intent of this was, and it's not to address projects. It would be things like, if you add schools, is there going to be a traffic impact in the neighborhoods or Mountain Rose Highway, things like that. It's not about a specific project. The proposal is to allow K through 12 schools on sites of 3 acres or more in the Wood Creek regulatory zone, which is shown. I think there's a slide, and also it's in the staff report. For your information, there are 2 applications for projects in that zone. So that's part of the reason the county is moving on this. One is St. Clair's of Tahoe, St. Francis Assisi has received a temporary permit and 2 6-month extensions. And the second extension is based on the understanding they are working on this area plan amendment with the county. And the Village Presbyterian Church has an application to create an academy. Both of those would be affected, but that's, again, not what we're here to talk about today. We're not, like the county said, they don't really want to discuss the amendment at this meeting. They like it postponed to next meeting, but we feel like you should invite the public who may have taken the time and effort to prepare comments to make them to you today in case they can't make it when this is put back on your agenda. And with that, that will end my comments.
Great, thank you, John. So now I guess we'll go to public comments straight off. Is there anyone in the room who would like to comment on this item? Seeing no one, we'll go online. Are there any hands raised online?
Mr. Chair, there are no hands raised online to comment on this item.
Okay, great, thank you. We did have some comments presented that are in your packet and are on the website from Scott Comstock, Marlene Burgess, and Kathleen and Ira Rodman. So those are in our packets, and hopefully everyone got a chance to read those, but we will be bringing that back in our next meeting next month. All right, that brings us to agenda item number 5, upcoming topics. As a reminder to the public, after committee discussion on this item, you may raise your hand in person to be called on, or in Zoom to be unmuted by TRPA staff to share your comments. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In September, we will have a significant, it will be a significant meeting because we're bringing the Tahoe Living Strategic Priority Phase 2 amendments on density height coverage to you for your consideration. And we will likely be scheduling the RPIC meeting after the governing board meeting because that may take a while. And then, of course, we'll have the Washoe County Tahoe Area Plan amendment that you just postponed. We are working on a package of climate smart amendments that we will bring this fall. And then specific dates haven't been determined, but there are area plan amendments coming from Placer County, South Lake Tahoe, and possibly Washoe County. And then next spring, we anticipate another set of process improvement amendments, a mixed use definition, additional climate smart amendments, possibly, and probably more area plan amendments. So RPIC members look for a lot of time with staff and on substantive issues over the next several months and into next calendar year. That's all I have on upcoming items, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Any committee members have any comments or questions? Nope. All right, we'll now go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the committee on this agenda item, please raise your hand either in person or by clicking the raise hand button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you'll be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. So anyone in the room? All right, seeing none. Any hands raised online? Poor Catherine, you're gonna get a lot of steps in
I might go
today.
sit over there.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair,
Please
there
do.
are no hands raised online to comment on this item.
All right, great. Then we'll close public item on this, public comment on this item. Any further comments from the committee? Seeing none, then we can move on with that item. And we'll go to agenda item 6, committee member comments. Are there any comments from the committee in general? Seeing none, we'll move on. Our final matter of business is our general public interest comment period. Any member of the public wishing to address the Regional Plan Implementation Committee on any item listed or not listed on the agenda may do so at this time. Individuals or groups who've already commented on items listed on the agenda are not permitted to comment on that same topic. The Regional Plan Implementation Committee is prohibited by law from taking immediate action on or discussing issues raised by the public during this public comment period. If any member of the public wishes to speak on this item, please raise your hand now, either in person by clicking the raise hand at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you'll be called on and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. Anyone in the room? All right, I don't see anyone. Anyone online, Catherine?
Mr. Chair, there are no hands raised to comment on this item.
All right, so we'll close public comments on this. So now all I need is a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
All right, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? All right, the motion passes. The meeting is adjourned at 10:30. The governing board meeting will proceed in this room and on this platform.